lavender, moonflowers, crushed healing herbs, warmed by her palms. Those scents had followed Celine through the palace halls for as long as she could remember. Lately, something else moved beneath them. Life, a second heartbeat, faint and stubborn, tucked just beneath her ribs. Celine believed the ivory folds of her healer's robes hid it well. She believed loose sleeves, careful posture, and a wide berth from the royal physicians would keep her secret buried a little longer, long enough to finish what she'd started. But the truth moved through the Nightbane court far ahead of her. Kaler already knew. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far the story travels. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a chapter of Celine and Kaler's story. And if this hook already has your heart racing, smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow. Now, let's find out what the king already knows. He had known for weeks. The change in her scent, the new rhythm of her pulse when he stood too close, the faint celestial light that now clung to her skin like something remembering itself. He had said nothing. He had only watched, and quietly closed every road she might use to run. Celine did not know that yet. She only knew the ache low in her back as she crossed the physician's hall that morning, a basket of crushed yarrow balanced against her hip, her spine held unnaturally straight to hide the curve beneath her robes. Soldiers nodded to her as she passed. Men she'd stitched back together after border skirmishes. Boys who called her Lady Celine, though she'd never asked for the title. A vampire noble bowed his head to her in the corridor, murmuring thanks for healing his daughter's fever. 3 nights passed. Even the human servants, who trusted almost no one in this castle of crimson banners and long teeth, softened when Celine came near. She was, by every account the kingdom gave her, the most gifted healer the Shadow Realm had seen in 100 years. What the kingdom didn't know, what Celine herself had only half understood until recently, was the bloodline sleeping in her veins, a celestial inheritance older than the vampire courts themselves, forgotten by everyone except the dust-covered archives beneath the palace. She hadn't gone looking for that truth. She'd gone looking for a way out. 9 weeks, she thought, pressing a hand briefly to her stomach as she ducked into an empty stairwell. 9 weeks since the charity accord at Blackthorn Hall, since Kaler had pulled her from a knife meant for someone else, since the two of them had ended up alone in his private chambers with the adrenaline still burning through both their blood. She remembered candlelight. She remembered his hand at her jaw, gentler than a king of his reputation had any right to be. She remembered thinking, foolishly, that for one night she had mattered to him as more than his most trusted healer. Morning had undone all of it. A servant, a healer, nothing close to the political alliance a king of death was expected to marry. She had told herself the night meant nothing to him. She had told herself it was safer to believe that. Then, 5 weeks later, the sickness came. Then the mist cycle. Then the quiet, private confirmation in the dead of night, alone, with shaking hands and a spell she'd learned from her own mentor. A child, his child. The first true royal heir in 3 centuries. If the court learned of it before she was gone, Celine knew exactly what would happen. Rival houses would circle the babe like carrion birds, each one scheming to control the throne through an infant too small to defend itself. And Kaler, ruthless, unreadable Kaler, who was called the King of Death in every vampire empire from the Shadow Realm to the Eastern courts, would see the child as a piece on a board, not as hers. So she had begun to plan. Maps of the old mountain passes stolen from the cartography wing, a forged travel writ, bought with 3 months of saved wages, dried herbs to ease the nausea on the road, a traveling cloak, plain and gray, nothing like the healer's ivory that marked her as palace-bound. She meant to be gone before the next full moon rose over the towers. Tonight, she told herself, tucking the last of the herbs into her satchel. Tonight I disappear, and no one will ever use this child as a weapon. She was still turning the plan over when a shadow fell across the stairwell door. Lady Celine, a royal messenger, young and out of breath, bowed low enough that his fringe nearly touched the stone floor. The king requests your presence. Now. The satchel slipped an inch in her hand. He knows, some instinct whispered, cold as the castle stone beneath her feet. He's known the whole time. She had no way yet to prove it. She only knew that her carefully built escape had just run out of road. Here's Chapter 2. The messenger led her through corridors, Celine had walked 1,000 times, and every one of them felt unfamiliar tonight. The palace at night was a different creature than the palace by day. Gothic arches stretched overhead, disappearing into shadow where the candlelight couldn't reach. Crimson banners bearing the Nightbane crest hung motionless along the stone walls, heavy velvet that seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows in long silver bars, cutting the corridor into pieces. Light, dark, like a countdown she couldn't stop. Vampire guards stood at every junction, silent and still as statues until she passed, their eyes tracking her with the particular attention reserved for someone already condemned. None of them spoke. None of them needed to. Celine had walked past these same guards 100 times as the court healer, offered polite nods, sometimes even a rare smile. Tonight, their silence felt like a verdict already reached. Her satchel was still hidden beneath her cloak and her quarters, maps and forged papers folded inside it. But she felt its absence like a phantom weight all the same. Every step toward Kaylor's private chambers felt like a step toward a gallows she built with her own hands. He can't know, she told herself over and over, a prayer with no real faith behind it. No one knows. I was careful. I was so careful. But some older, quieter part of her, the part that had watched Kaylor Nightbane, read a room, read a lie, read a person's whole history in the space of a glance, already understood that carefulness had never been enough. Not with him. The doors to his private chamber stood at the end of the final hallway, twice her height, black wood banded in iron. The 2 guards stationed there opened them without a word as she approached, and then she was standing on the threshold, and there was nowhere left to walk but forward. The chamber was exactly as it always was, and somehow it had never looked so vast. Massive windows lined the far wall, floor to ceiling, framing the night skyline of the Shadow Realm. Spires and rooftops black against a sky where a full moon hung low in silver, wreathed in thin cloud. Candles burned in iron sconces along the walls, dozens of them, their light catching on gold thread and dark stone, and above the hearth watching over the room, the way she always had, hung the portrait of Queen Lysandra Nightbane, dark-haired, crowned, her painted eyes carrying a sorrow that Celine had never fully understood, until tonight, when she finally felt the weight of what it meant to love someone in this family. Kaylor stood near the throne at the center of the room, his back partly to her, his pale hair loose over the black and crimson of his coat. He didn't turn immediately. He let the silence stretch long enough that Celine's pulse climbed into her throat. "You wanted to see me, my lord." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. He turned then, and whatever punishment she had braced herself for, chains, accusation, the cold, formal fury of a king betrayed, none of it was in his face. His dark eyes found her across the candlelit room, and there was something in them she had no name for, something that looked almost like grief. He crossed the room, slowly, unhurried, the way he moved when he wanted a person to feel the inevitability of him rather than the threat. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, and he lifted her chin with 2 fingers, gentle in a way that undid her far more than cruelty ever could have. "I know," he said quietly. 2 words, the whole world tilted around them. Celine's breath caught somewhere behind her ribs. She opened her mouth, to deny it, to explain, to beg. She didn't know which, and nothing came out at all. The silence between them stretched, heavy with candlelight and the distant hush of the wind against the windows. "I have known for weeks," Kaylor said, his voice low, steady, terribly gentle. "I noticed the change in you before you noticed it yourself. Your heartbeat, your scent, the way your hand goes to your stomach when you think no one is watching." His thumb brushed once along her jaw. "I know about the maps you took from the cartography wing. I know about the forged writ hidden in your travel case. I know you meant to be gone before the next full moon." Celine felt the tears rise before she could stop them. Hot and humiliating and impossible to hold back any longer. Every lie she had told, just a new diet, just tired, just running errands, rose up in her memory and shattered against the plain fact of his knowledge. He had let her believe she was hidden. He had let her believe, for weeks, that her secret was still her own. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking apart on the single word. "Why did you let me think?" "Because I was waiting for you to trust me enough to tell me yourself." Something flickered across his face, something almost like pain. And you never did. So I stopped waiting. The tears came freely now, and Celine didn't have the strength left to hide them. Not here, not under Queen Lysandra's painted eyes, not with his hand still cradling her jaw like something he was afraid to break. She had spent 9 weeks preparing for chains, for accusation, for a king who would see only the throne in the air and never the woman standing in front of him. She had not prepared for this, for gentleness, for a silence that asked nothing of her but honesty. I thought, she managed, that if you knew, you would lock me away, that you would take the child and I would never. Celine, her name in his mouth, stopped her cold. His hand slid from her chin to cup the side of her face, and for the first time since she'd walked through those iron doors, his voice lost its careful control. Look at me. I would never imprison you. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Celine stood with her face still cradled in his hand, tears drying tight and salty on her skin, and Kaler watched her the way he might have watched something he was afraid to name aloud, in case naming it broke the spell. I need you to understand something, he said finally, and I need you to hear all of it before you decide I'm lying to you. She nodded, because she couldn't yet trust her voice. He drew a slow breath. Ha ha! And for the first time since she'd known him, 4 years of ledgers and battle reports and quiet nights in the infirmary while he waited for news of his soldiers, Kaler Nightbane looked uncertain. I have loved you since before that night, he said. Long before. I watched you stitch wounds from men who couldn't pay you and never once complained. I watched you sit with dying soldiers so they wouldn't die alone, human and vampire alike, as if the war itself meant nothing next to a frightened man's hand in yours. His jaw tightened. I told myself it didn't matter, that a king doesn't get to want his healer, that the court would tear you apart before they ever let you near a crown, and I would not do that to you. Nay, let me finish. His thumb traced once along her cheekbone, gentle enough that it stole the rest of her protest. That night at Blackthorn Hall wasn't an accident of adrenaline, Celine. I have wanted you for years. I only finally stopped pretending otherwise. He paused, and when you left before dawn, I let you go because I thought you needed time. I never imagined you'd spend that time planning to disappear. Celine shook her head slowly, the pieces rearranging themselves in her mind faster than she could hold onto them. You said you knew about the maps, the writ, everything She stopped, something cold moving through her. How long have you actually known? Since the 2nd week? His voice was steady, but something flickered behind his eyes, something almost like guilt. I had every route out of the Shadow Realm watched. Every mountain pass, every border crossing, every ship leaving the northern ports. The floor seemed to tilt beneath her. You were going to stop me. No. The word came out fierce, immediate. I was going to protect you. He took her hands in his, and his grip was careful, deliberate, as if he needed her to feel the truth of it through touch. Since words kept failing him, the moment the court learns an heir exists, every rival house in this kingdom will want you dead before the child can be born, and every assassin desperate enough to try will be hunting a pregnant woman traveling alone. I didn't station guards on those roads to bring you back in chains, Salim. I stationed them so that if anyone tried to touch you out there in the dark, they would not succeed. Celine stared up at him, the anger she'd been ready to feel dissolving into something far more disorienting. You let me believe I was free to run, while you were keeping me safer than I ever could have kept myself. I would rather you hate me for controlling your fate, he said quietly, than mourn you for losing it. She didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure one existed. Kaler released her hands, and for a moment Celine thought he meant to step back, to return to the careful distance a king was supposed to keep. Instead, he sank slowly to one knee before her right there on the stone floor. Beneath his mother's portrait, and the sight of it, the King of Death feared across 4 empires. Kneeling in his own throne room, stole what little breath Celine had left. Kaler, what are you? I never wanted another queen. He looked up at her, and there was nothing guarded left in his face at all. Nothing of the cold, calculating king the court whispered about in fearful voices. Not in 300 years of being told I needed one. Not for the alliances my council begged me to make. Not for the bloodlines they wanted me to strengthen. I only ever wanted you, and I told myself for years that wanting was as far as it could go. He glanced up, briefly, at the portrait above the hearth. Queen Lysandra, painted in the same candlelight that lit the room now, her eyes carrying that same old sorrow Celine had never understood until tonight. "My mother died protecting this bloodline," Kaler said. "She never got to choose the life she wanted. I have spent 300 years believing that was simply what it meant to wear this crown, that love was a luxury the throne couldn't afford." His hand found hers again, and this time his voice didn't waver at all. "I refuse to let you make her sacrifice a second time. I refuse to let you disappear into the dark because you believed, even for one night, that I valued this throne more than you." Celine's breath came unsteady. Her free hand pressed instinctively over the place where their child rested beneath her ribs. "I will marry you," Kaler said. "Before this court, before every rival house that thinks they can threaten what's mine. You are my queen, Celine. You were my queen the moment I realized I would burn this kingdom to ash, before I let anyone take you from me." For a long moment, Celine simply stared at him, kneeling there in the candlelight beneath his mother's portrait, and she could not make herself believe this was real. Weeks of terror, of hiding, of preparing to vanish into the mountains alone with nothing but a satchel and the lie. And here was the answer she had never once let herself imagine. "You can't mean that," she whispered. "The council will never accept." "They will accept whatever I decide," Kaler said, rising to his feet, his hand never leaving hers, "and they will learn tonight." As if in answer deep beneath them, the great bronze bells of the palace began to ring, slow, deliberate tolls that echoed through every stone corridor of the castle, summoning every noble house in the Shadow Realm to an assembly that had not been called in over a century. Celine's heart climbed into her throat. "What have you done?" Kaler's eyes didn't leave hers. "I've told them there's a new heir to announce." The great hall had not seen a full assembly in over 100 years, and yet within the hour every seat beneath its vaulted ceiling was filled. Celine stood at the edge of the dais, still in her healer's robes, her hands folded over the swell of her stomach, as if she could shield it from the 100 pairs of eyes now fixed on her. Crimson banners hung between the stone columns. Candlelight flickered against gold filigree and ancient armor mounted along the walls, relics of wars fought before her grandmother's grandmother was born. And below the dais, arranged in their old rigid hierarchy, sat the vampire houses of the Shadow Realm, houses that had ruled beside the night being crowned for 3 centuries, and had waited just as long for a reason to challenge it. Kaler stood beside her, dressed now in the black and crimson of full court regalia, his crown catching the candlelight like something forged from midnight itself. When he raised his hand, the murmuring hall fell into silence. "For over 300 years," he said, his voice carrying easily to the highest gallery, "this house has had no true heir. Tonight, that changes." His hand found Celine's, steady and sure in front of every noble in the realm. "Celine Veramont carries my child. She will be crowned my queen. And any house that threatens her, or the heir she carries, will answer to me directly." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 2 seconds before it shattered into chaos. Some of the reaction was genuine joy. Older nobles rising to their feet murmuring old blessings Celine barely recognized. A few even weeping openly at the thought of an heir returning to a bloodline they'd assumed was ending with Kaler himself. But threaded through the celebration was something colder, something that moved through the hall like a current beneath still water. Celine felt it most sharply, from 2 houses seated near the front, closest to the throne, closest to power. They had spent centuries consolidating. The House of Duskfang occupied the left gallery, led by Lord Ashen, Duskfang, a gaunt, ancient vampire whose family had provided 3 of the last 5 royal advisors. His expression didn't shift at all during Kaler's announcement. No surprise, no joy, nothing but a stillness that Celine found far more unsettling than open hostility would have been. Across the aisle, the House of Valcour watched with open, undisguised calculation. Lady Elvain Valcour, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, had spent the last 2 years quietly maneuvering her own niece toward a political marriage with Kaler, a marriage that would have bound the Valcour bloodline permanently to the throne. Celine had heard the rumors even in the infirmary, healers gossiping over wound dressings about which house the king might finally choose. She understood now, watching Lady Valcour's face carefully arrange itself into a smile, exactly how much that ambition had just been destroyed in a single sentence. and above them, both seated in the elevated gallery, reserved for the realm's oldest authority, sat the Crimson Council, 7 ancient vampire lords whose bloodlines predated even Queen Lyssandra's reign, whose approval had once been required for every royal marriage in the kingdom's history. Kaler had not asked for their approval tonight. He had simply told them what would be. Selene watched the eldest counselor, a silent, white-eyed vampire named Miro Stain, lean toward Lord Duskfang and murmur something too quiet for her to hear. Duskfang's expression still didn't change, but his eyes moved to Selene's stomach and lingered there, and something about the way he looked at her made her fold her arms tighter across herself. The assembly dissolved gradually into smaller conversations. Nobles approaching the dais to offer formal congratulations. All of it performed with the same practiced elegance the court used for everything. Sincere gratitude and quiet threat wearing identical smiles. Keeler kept Selene close through all of it, his hand rarely leaving hers, his eyes tracking every house with the same watchfulness she'd once mistaken for coldness, and now understood with simply vigilance. She didn't see what happened after the hall emptied. She wasn't meant to. Deep beneath the palace, in a chamber lit by a single black candle, Lord Ashen Duskfang closed the door behind him and turned to the 2 figures already waiting. "You heard him," Lady Valcour said, arms folded tightly across her chest, all pretense of celebration stripped from her voice now. 300 years, I have watched this throne stand empty of a true heir, and he chooses a healer. A woman with no house, no bloodline, the council recognizes, nothing but a pretty face and a gift for stitching wounds. She is not merely a healer, Maros Thane said quietly from the shadows near the far wall. His white eyes reflected the candlelight strangely, without warmth. I have read the old texts. There is a bloodline older than ours sleeping in her. Celestial blood. The kind our ancestors warred against before the first vampire crown was forged. If the rumors in the archive are true, that child will carry power neither of our houses can match, let alone control. Duskfang's expression finally shifted, something sharp and cold moving behind his ancient eyes. Then the child cannot be permitted to draw breath, and the mother, Valcour added, cannot be permitted to survive to protect it. A long silence settled over the chamber, broken only by the faint hiss of the candle flame. The king will have guards on her day and night now, Thane said. Assassination inside these walls will not be simple. Nothing worth having ever is. Duskfang moved to the narrow window at the back of the chamber, looking out over the moonlit rooftops of the Shadow Realm, where somewhere among the shattered alleys a hired blade already waited for word. We do not need her dead tonight. We need her dead before that child is born, before the celestial power in her blood has time to protect it. There is still time to arrange an accident, a fall, a poison too subtle for the royal physicians to trace. Lady Valcour's smile returned, thin and merciless. Then let us not waste the time we have. Far above them, past a dozen locked doors, and 100 sleeping guards, a lone figure in a hooded cloak slipped through a servant's passage near the eastern wall, moving silently, deliberately, toward the private wing where the palace's new healer-turned-queen now slept. Selene woke to the sound of her own door easing shut. For a half-second, she thought it was a servant, come to check the hearth fire before dawn. Then the shape detached itself from the shadows near the window, and every instinct she had went cold and sharp at once. The hooded figure crossed the room in 3 silent strides, a blade already drawn, moonlight catching along its edge. Selene rolled from the bed on pure reflex, her healer's training doing what her terror couldn't. Assess the threat, find the exit, protect the child first. But she was slower now, heavier, her balance thrown by months of carrying a life she couldn't defend as easily as her own. The blade came down toward her stomach, and Selene threw her arms up with a scream that tore itself out of her before she'd even decided to make a sound. The light came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It erupted from her skin, from her chest, from the place where her hands crossed protectively over her unborn child, a radiant, burning, white gold light that filled the chamber like a second sun had been born inside it. The assassin's blade never reached her. It stopped inches from her skin, held frozen by something neither of them understood, and then the light surged outward and struck him full in the chest. He didn't scream. He simply dissolved into ash and shadow, the way old, cursed things did when something purer than they were finally found. The light didn't fade. It pulsed instead, steady as a heartbeat, radiating from Celine in slow golden waves that turned the entire chamber to daylight. Guards burst through the door moments later, weapons drawn, and froze in the threshold at the sight of her, kneeling on the floor amid the wreckage of her overturned nightstand, glowing like something out of the old texts none of them had believed were real. Kaler arrived seconds after, and whatever composure 300 years of ruling had taught him abandoned him entirely at the sight of her. Celine. He was across the room before she could speak, his hands hovering over her as if afraid to touch the light itself. "Are you hurt?" The child. "I don't." Celine looked down at her own glowing hands, shaking, uncomprehending. "I don't know what's happening to me." The light held for another long moment, then slowly withdrew back into her skin like a tide retreating, leaving her trembling and cold in the wreckage of her room, but whole, unharmed. The child. When Kaler pressed a careful hand to her stomach and closed his eyes to listen for the pulse only vampire hearing could catch, was steady and strong. "She healed herself," one of the guards murmured, staring at the scorched black outline on the floorboards where the assassin had stood only moments before. That wasn't defense magic. That was something older. Kaler's eyes found Celine's, and there was something in them she hadn't seen before. Not fear, not confusion, but a dawning, careful understanding. "I need the royal archives opened," he said without looking away from her. "Tonight, every text on the old bloodlines, everything predating the first vampire crown." The archive beneath the palace hadn't been fully searched in generations, its lower shelves thick with dust and disuse. But Kaler's scholars worked through what remained of the night by candlelight, pulling scrolls and bound volumes so old their leather had gone soft as cloth. It was nearly dawn when the royal archivist, a thin, anxious vampire named Corwin, found the passage that changed everything. "My king." His hands trembled as he laid the ancient text across the reading table, its pages the color of weak tea. "This predates even Queen Lysandra's line. It speaks of a celestial bloodline, beings of light who walked before the first vampire ever drew breath, who wove their power into the world's oldest wards." He turned the fragile page carefully. The text says the bloodline was scattered and hidden generations ago, deliberately, to protect its descendants from the wars between vampire houses, hidden so thoroughly that even its own descendants would not know what they carried. Celine, seated beside Kaler with a blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, felt something cold settle in her chest. "My mother never spoke of anything like this. My grandmother raised me. There was never—" "That may have been the point," Corwin said gently. "A secret kept even from the ones who carried it, so it could never be tortured out of them." Kaler's jaw was tight as he read over Corwin's shoulder, his finger tracing a line of old script. "There's more." Corwin nodded and turned to the final page, where the ink had faded nearly to nothing, but the words were still legible if you knew to look. "A prophecy," he said quietly. "It says that when celestial blood and vampire blood are finally joined, not by conquest, but by love, freely chosen, the child born of that union will carry both powers united in one bloodline, for the first time since the world was young. That child, the text says, will hold the power to end the old curses between our people and the light born forever." The room fell utterly silent. Celine looked down at her own hands, still faintly warm from whatever had moved through her hours before, and then at the gentle curve of her stomach, and understood for the first time exactly what she was carrying. Not just an heir to a throne, something the world had been waiting 300 years to see born. Kaler's hand found hers again, steady despite everything. "Whatever you are," he said quietly, "whatever that child becomes, I will not let anyone take either of you from this world before your time." Celine wanted to believe that would be enough, but 300 miles to the south, in a stone chapel, hidden beneath the ruins of an old cathedral, a different kind of hunter was reading a different copy of the same forgotten prophecy. One that had survived in human hands for generations, waiting for exactly this moment to matter again. And for the first time in 3 centuries, the Order of the Sacred Blade began preparing for a holy war. The chapel beneath the ruined cathedral had not held a full congregation in over a century, but on the night the prophecy resurfaced, every remaining member of the Order of the Sacred Blade knelt within its cracked stone walls. Their leader was a woman named Sister Amara Voss, silver-templed and unyielding, her face marked with the faded scars of decades spent hunting things older and darker than herself. She stood before the altar with the ancient text open in her hands, its pages the same faded ink Corwin had uncovered in the Nightbane archives, and read the prophecy aloud to a room full of fanatics who had waited their entire lives for a war their ancestors had failed to finish. "A child of celestial light and vampire darkness," she said, her voice carrying through the stone chamber like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Born to end the old curses," the text says, but we know what it truly means. A child that powerful, raised by the Nightbane crown, will not end the war between our kind. It will end us. The hunters around her did not question. They had spent generations training with holy weapons blessed in rites older than the vampire courts themselves. Silver blades etched with warding script crossbows carved from ash trees said to have grown from martyrs' graves. Ancient relics recovered from ruins the vampire houses had long since forgotten existed. Every one of them had been raised on stories of a coming reckoning. Tonight, that reckoning had a name, a face, and a due date. "We move on the border villages first," Sister Voss said. "Draw the king's attention outward. Force him to divide his forces before we ever reach the child." Within 3 days, the first villages burned. Word reached the Shadow Realm Palace in the gray hours before dawn, a border settlement near the Eastern Pass, razed overnight. Its vampire residents slaughtered. Its human residents who had sheltered there for the crown's protection, dragged out and questioned before being left for the soldiers to find. The messenger who delivered the news to Kaler's war chamber could barely keep his voice steady. "They're not raiding for supplies," he said. "They're hunting for something." They asked every survivor the same question before they burned the granaries. "Where is the healer who carries the king's child?" Kaler's expression didn't change. But Celine, standing at the edge of the war table with her hand resting instinctively over her stomach, saw something harden behind his eyes that she recognized now as more than anger. It was fear, disguised the only way a king was permitted to wear it. Within the hour, the entire kingdom was in motion. Kaler mobilized every garrison from the capital to the border, pulled soldiers from posts that had stood unmanned for decades, sent riders to every allied house with a single message: the human hunters had returned. And this time, they would not stop at the old treaties. Celine tried to help in the only way she knew how. Wounded soldiers and displaced villagers began arriving at the palace within days, and despite Kaler's protests, she refused to stay confined to her chambers while people bled in the infirmary halls below. "You are 7 months pregnant," Kaler said, finding her elbow deep in bandages one evening, a line of exhausted, frightened refugees still waiting for her attention. "You nearly died in your own bedchamber 3 weeks ago, and I healed myself in the process," Celine said, not looking up from the wound she was closing, a young soldier's shoulder torn open by a holy blade that had left the flesh burning long after the cut itself had stopped bleeding. "These people ran from their homes because of what I carry, Kaler. I will not sit in a gilded room while they suffer for it." He didn't argue further. He simply pulled a second chair to her table and sat beside her, silently handing her clean linens and passing instruments with the quiet efficiency of a man determined to stay close enough to catch her if her strength finally gave out. It became, in the strange, exhausting weeks that followed, a kind of ritual between them. Celine healed through the days, her body growing heavier and slower, her celestial light flickering faintly beneath her skin whenever her power strained too far. And Kaler, King of Death, to every enemy beyond the palace walls, spent his nights sitting beside her cot, holding cool cloths to her forehead when the exhaustion made her fever spike, reading old healing texts aloud in a low voice until she finally slept. "You don't have to stay every night," she murmured to him once, half asleep, candlelight flickering low against the chamber walls. "I know," Kaler said, brushing a strand of hair from her face with the gentleness the court would never have believed of him. "I want to." There were quiet moments in those weeks that Celine would carry with her long after the war ended, whatever became of it, Kaler's hand resting over hers when the child kicked hard enough to steal her breath. His low laugh, rare and unguarded the first time he felt it himself, the way he'd taken to reading reports at her bedside rather than his own war chamber, simply so he wouldn't be far if she needed him. She had spent so long believing love was a luxury this crown couldn't afford. She was beginning to understand that Kaler had simply been waiting for someone worth spending it on. The war outside their quiet chamber did not slow to match their tenderness. By the 4th week, the Order of the Sacred Blade had pushed past the border garrisons entirely, their numbers swollen by zealots from allied human strongholds who saw the coming child as either salvation or annihilation, depending on which side of the old war their families had died on. Village after village fell along the eastern approach, each one bringing the hunters closer to the capital, closer to the palace walls, closer to the woman they believed carried the end of their world inside her. Celine woke on the morning of the 5th week to the sound of alarm bells ringing across the entire city, and Kaler already at the window, his jaw tight, watching the horizon. She rose slowly, one hand braced against her lower back, and crossed to stand beside him. Beyond the palace walls, stretching from the eastern hills to the edge of the moonlit forest, the combined forces of the Order of the Sacred Blade and their allies had encircled the entire capital. The castle was surrounded. The first horns sounded at dawn, low and mournful, echoing off the castle walls like a death knell. Celine stood at the window beside Kaler, watching the tide of torches and holy banners ripple across the horizon, and felt the child inside her go still, as if even the unborn heir sensed what was coming. "Get to the lower sanctuary," Kaler said, already moving toward the door, his voice shifting into something harder, colder. The voice of a king preparing for war rather than the man who'd read her to sleep the night before. "The healers will need you there regardless. Stay behind the wards." "Kaler, please." He turned back, just once, and the fear beneath his composure was unmistakable now, impossible to hide. "I cannot fight this battle and worry for you both at the same time. Let me have this one certainty." She nodded, because she understood, even as every instinct in her rebelled against hiding while others bled. By mid-morning, the Order of the Sacred Blade breached the outer wall. What followed was a battle unlike anything the Shadow Realm had seen in 3 centuries. Holy arrows arced over the ramparts, trailing thin lines of white fire. Vampire soldiers met the invading lines with the brutal, practiced efficiency of a kingdom that had survived worse sieges, but the hunters fought with the particular ferocity of zealots who believed their god stood behind every blow. Ground that had been a peaceful garden a week before turned to churned mud and blood before noon, and at the center of it all stood Kaler Nightbane, and the court finally understood, for the first time in a generation, exactly why the empires beyond their borders called him the King of Death. He moved through the battlefield like something the old wars had forgotten how to kill. A hunter's silver blade found his shoulder, and he barely seemed to register the wound before the man who'd wielded it was dead at his feet. He fought not with the wild fury Celine had expected from the stories, but with a terrible, focused calm. Every movement precise, every kill deliberate, a king clearing a path back to the woman he'd sworn to protect. The betrayal came at midday, when the battle was already tilting toward chaos. A contingent of soldiers from the House of Duskfang, stationed along the eastern rampart to hold the line against the second wave, simply stepped aside and let the hunters through. Kaler saw it happen from across the courtyard, watched Lord Duskfang's men part like a door swinging open, watched hunters pour through the gap, laughing at how easily the ancient house had sold its own crown for a promise of survival once the celestial bloodline was finally extinguished. Something in Kaler's expression went very still. He crossed the battlefield in a blur too fast for human eyes to follow, and Duskfang's soldiers didn't have time to raise their weapons before he was among them. What happened in the next several minutes would be spoken of in the Shadow Realm for generations. Kaler did not simply defeat the traitors. He unmade them, one by one, with a precision that made even his own soldier step back and watch in silent horror. When it was finished, Lord Duskfang himself stood alone amid his fallen house, and Kaler's hand closed around his throat. 300 years my family kept yours in power, Kaler said, his voice carrying across the sudden silence of the courtyard. Tonight you sold my unborn child to zealots who mean to burn her mother alive. Please, my king, you will not see tomorrow. And then Duskfang, too, was gone, ash scattering into the smoke-choked air, and the remaining vampire houses watching from the walls understood with absolute clarity exactly what treason would cost from this day forward. In the lower sanctuary, Celine had abandoned any pretense of hiding the moment the wounded began arriving in earnest. Civilians who'd sheltered in the outer districts streamed into the palace grounds as the fighting spread, children and elders and terrified mothers who had nowhere else to run. and Celine worked among them with a desperation that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the simple, unbearable fact that she could not stand by while people died around her. When a stray volley of holy fire arced over the sanctuary wall, aimed at a cluster of fleeing civilians, Celine didn't think. She simply reached for the power that had saved her once already, and the light answered. It rose from her in a great shimmering dome, gold white and steady, arching over the courtyard just as the holy fire struck it and scattered harmlessly against the barrier. The civilians beneath it stared upward in stunned silence, and Celine, gasping with the effort, kept the light steady around them even as pain lanced through her lower back. She thought of Queen Lysandra as she held the barrier, thought of the portrait in Kaler's chambers, the woman who had given everything to protect a bloodline she'd never lived to see flourish. Celine understood her now in a way she hadn't before. This was what it meant to be Nightbane. Not the crown, not the throne. This. The barrier held for nearly an hour, sheltering wounded and fleeing civilians alike, while the battle raged beyond it, until the pain in Celine's back sharpened into something unmistakable. Something that made her stumble and nearly lose her hold on the light entirely. "My lady!" One of the palace healers caught her before she fell, alarm flooding his face. "Your lady! Your—" Celine barely heard him. A fresh wave of pain tore through her, low and violent. And this time, there was no mistaking it for exhaustion. "No," she gasped, pressing a hand to her stomach as warmth spread beneath her healer's robes. Weeks too early. Terrifyingly too early. No, not now, not yet. The barrier above them flickered, dimmed, and finally collapsed, as Celine's concentration shattered entirely, her legs giving out beneath her. "Someone find the king!" The healer shouted, catching her fully as she went down, his voice cracking with panic over the din of battle still raging beyond the sanctuary walls. "Tell him the queen is in labor." Across the courtyard through smoke and fire, and the ash of fallen traitors, Kaler's head snapped toward the sanctuary at the sound of his soldiers' shouts, and for the first time all day, the King of Death felt something closer to terror than any blade had managed to draw from him. Kaler reached the sanctuary before the echo of the shout had finished crossing the courtyard. Blood, not his own, still slick on his hands. His crown knocked askew from the fighting. Nothing about the battle raging behind him mattered anymore. Celine. He dropped to his knees beside the cot where the healers had laid her, gathering her hand in both of his as another contraction tore through her, her spine arching with a cry she couldn't fully swallow. "It's too early," she gasped between breaths, sweat plastering dark hair to her forehead. "Kaler, it's weeks too early. Something's wrong. I'm here," he said, and did not let go of her hand. "I'm not leaving." The battle. One of his generals began from the doorway. Breathless, blood-streaked. "My king, the eastern wall is failing. We need. Hold the wall without me." Kaler didn't look up. "I am not leaving this room." The general hesitated only a moment before he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had just watched his king unmake an entire noble house for treason, that no argument would move him. He turned and ran back toward the fighting alone. The palace itself seemed to be coming apart around them. Somewhere above, a section of the eastern tower collapsed under holy fire, sending tremors through the stone floor beneath the cot. Dust sifted down from the sanctuary ceiling with every impact outside. The physicians worked in the flickering candlelight, their hands unsteady, and Celine watched the growing fear on their faces with a healer's practiced eye, understanding what they weren't saying long before anyone spoke it aloud. "The child is turned wrong," the eldest physician finally admitted, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "And her strength is failing. If we cannot, then help her," Kaler said, low and dangerous. "My king, we have tried everything within our knowledge. This is beyond what medicine alone can do." Celine, through the haze of pain and exhaustion, felt something shift inside her chest. Not panic, but recognition. She had healed a stranger's mortal wound with nothing but instinct weeks ago. She had held a barrier over an entire courtyard of terrified civilians. She understood now, with sudden and absolute clarity, that the power sleeping in her blood had never been severed from her. It was hers to command, if only she had the strength left to reach for it. "Kaler." She gripped his hand hard enough to bruise. "Whatever happens, whatever it costs me, save the child first." "No," His voice cracked entirely for the first time since she'd known him. "I will not choose between you. I refuse." "You may not have to," Celine whispered, and closed her eyes and reached inward for the light. It came slower this time, harder wan, drawn from a body already exhausted past its limits. But it came. A faint golden glow began to spread beneath her skin, gathering at her stomach, at her hands where Kaler still held them, threading through her like something ancient, finally remembering its purpose. The physician stepped back, murmuring in astonishment, as the light grew steadier, warmer, wrapping around her and the child both like a second heartbeat made visible. "That's it," the physician breathed. "The child is turning. Celine, you must push now. Whatever strength you have left." Celine did not remember much of what followed with any clarity afterward. Kaler's hand never left hers. His forehead pressed to her temple, murmuring something low and constant, in a language older than the vampire courts. Words she didn't understand but felt like an anchor all the same. The light around her flared and dimmed and flared again with every wave of pain. The sanctuary walls trembling with distant battle. The whole world narrowing to the single, desperate act of bringing a life into it. And then, after what felt like hours and was perhaps only minutes, a thin, furious cry cut through the chaos. The light exploded outward. It was not the fierce, defensive burst that had destroyed the assassin weeks before. This was something gentler and vaster. A wave of radiant gold-white light that swept out from Celine in every direction. Through the sanctuary walls, through the crumbling stone of the palace. Out across the battlefield beyond, Kaler lifted his daughter into the light, with hands that shook for the first time in 300 years, and stared down at a tiny, furious face streaked with the same faint celestial glow that had saved her mother twice already. "She's healthy," the physician said, wonder overtaking the exhaustion in his voice. "My king, she's whole. They're both alive." Outside, on the battlefield, something ancient finally broke. Soldiers on both sides felt it before they understood it. A shudder that moved through the ground itself, through the old cursed weapons the hunters carried, through the shadow magic that had bound the Nightbane bloodline to darkness for 3 centuries. Holy blades that had burned with unnatural fire since the Order first forged them, suddenly dimmed to ordinary steel. Ancient relics, carried by the Crimson Council's oldest allies, crumbled to dust in their wielders' hands. Ash-cursed nobles, who had fought for generations under the weight of Lyssandra's unbroken curse, felt something lift from their shoulders they hadn't known was there. Above the battlefield, the full moon that had hung heavy and blood-tinged all through the siege slowly and possibly turned to silver, pure and bright as it hadn't shone in 300 years. Bathing the ruined courtyard and the exhausted soldiers in the smoking wreckage of the eastern tower in soft, clean light. Hunters lowered weapons that no longer burned with holy fire, staring upward in confusion. Vampire soldiers who had fought with grim, cursed endurance felt strength returning to limbs that had been failing for hours. On both sides of a war 3 centuries in the making, exhausted fighters simply stopped, uncertain, staring at a sky that had just changed before their eyes. In the sanctuary, Kaler knelt beside Celine with their daughter cradled against his chest. Tears he made no effort to hide, cutting clean tracks through the blood and ash on his face. And outside the shattered walls of his ancestral home, for the first time in over 300 years, the battle simply stopped. The silence on the battlefield didn't last. Sister Amara Voss stood amid her scattered order, watching hunters lower weapons that no longer burned with holy fire, and something like desperation crossed her scarred face. She had spent her whole life preparing for this war. She was not prepared to watch it end without her. "The prophecy is a lie," she shouted, dragging one of her remaining soldiers upright by the collar. "A trick of the light, nothing more. The child is not salvation. She is the end of everything we—" She never finished the sentence. Kaler crossed what remained of the battlefield with his daughter, still cradled safely behind him in the sanctuary, but the fury he'd carried since dawn had not fully left him, and Sister Voss had chosen the worst possible moment to reach for the blade still sheathed at her hip. He was in front of her before she could draw it. "The war is over," Kaler said, and something in his voice made even his own soldiers go still. "Your order came to murder a mother and an infant in her cradle. There will be no honor recorded for that in any history you write. She will destroy us," Voss spat, wild-eyed, grasping at the last threads of a purpose that had governed her entire life. The old texts warned. The old texts also warned that light and dark could not coexist, Kaler said quietly. You watched the moon turn silver an hour ago. You felt your own weapons lose their fire. The prophecy was never a warning, Sister Voss. It was a promise. You simply chose not to read it that way. She lunged anyway, blade first, driven by 300 years of inherited hatred rather than any strategy left to her. Kaler ended it before the blade ever cleared its arc, swift and final. And when it was done, he did not linger over her fallen body, the way he had lingered over Duskfang's ashes weeks before. There was no satisfaction in this one, only relief that it was finished. Around the ruined courtyard, the remaining hunters and the last loyalist soldiers of the scattered vampire houses lowered their weapons one by one, understanding without being told that whatever war they'd been fighting had ended the moment the moon changed color above them. Some knelt, some simply walked away into the dawn, weapons abandoned in the mud, too exhausted or too disillusioned to carry them any further. Kaler didn't watch them go. He was already turning back, toward the sanctuary, toward the only thing that had ever mattered more to him than the crown on his head. Selim was sitting up when he returned, pale and exhausted but alive, their daughter asleep against her chest, wrapped in a healer's shawl someone had found in the chaos. The faint golden glow still lingered beneath both their skins, fading slowly now, like embers settling after a fire. Kaler stopped in the doorway and simply looked at them for a long moment, as if he needed to confirm with his own eyes that this was real and not some cruel trick his exhausted mind had conjured on the battlefield. Then he crossed the room, sank down beside the cot, and gathered them both into his arms as carefully as he had ever held anything in 300 years of life. The King of Death feared across 4 empires whose name alone had once empty battlefields wept without any attempt to hide it, his face pressed against his daughter's small dark head, his shoulders shaking with a grief and a relief too large to hold separately anymore. I thought I would lose you both, he said, voice raw and unguarded, in a way the court would never have believed possible. I have buried everyone I have ever loved except you. I could not have survived burying you too. Celine lifted a hand to his face, exhausted but steady. You didn't, she said softly. We're here. He looked up at her then, and something in his expression shifted from grief into something quieter, something that had been building since the night he'd first lifted her chin and told her, I know. Marry me, he said. Not for the throne, not for the child, though I love her already more than I have words for. Marry me because I cannot imagine another 300 years that do not have you in them. Selim Healer's daughter, hidden heir to a bloodline older than the crown itself, looked down at the tiny face sleeping against her chest, and then up at the man who had chosen her over every ambition his court had ever demanded of him. Yes, she said, and meant it with everything left in her. The coronation took place 3 weeks later, once the palace had begun to heal and the last of the wounded had been tended. The great hall, so recently a battlefield of politics and threat, was transformed for the occasion. Crimson banners restrung candlelight warmer than Celine had ever seen it, the assembled court no longer fractured by ancient rivalries but united tentatively, cautiously around the promise the prophecy had finally delivered. Celine walked the length of the hall in robes of deep crimson and gold, nothing like the healer's ivory she had once hidden beneath. Kaler stood waiting at the dais, their infant daughter held gently in the arms of the eldest court healer nearby, and when the crown was finally lowered onto Celine's head, the hall erupted not into political calculation, but into something that sounded for the first time in centuries like genuine celebration. Above the throne, Queen Lysandra's portrait watched over the ceremony as it always had, but something about it seemed different now to everyone who looked up at it. The old sorrow in her painted eyes no longer read as grief alone, but as the quiet hope of a woman who had given everything so that a day like this could exist. In the weeks that followed, the fragile peace between vampire and human began, tentatively, to take root. Border villages that had burned were rebuilt with both human and vampire hands, working side by side. The remnants of the Order of the Sacred Blade, leaderless and disillusioned, slowly disbanded. Some even finding their way into the new alliance being carefully built between the two peoples their ancestors had warred against for centuries. It was not perfect. It was not swift, but it was real, and it was hers. On a quiet evening not long after, Celine walked the same palace corridors she had once crept through in the dark, satchel hidden beneath her cloak, planning to disappear before dawn. Tonight she walked them openly, crowned queen of the Crimson Kingdom, her daughter cradled against her shoulder, Kaler's hand resting warm and certain against the small of her back. The corridors that had once echoed with her fear now echoed with something else entirely. Laughter from the kitchens, music drifting from the lower hall, the ordinary, precious sounds of a kingdom finally at peace with itself. Celine had spent so long believing she needed to hide to survive. She understood now, walking beside the king, who had chosen her above every crown, every alliance, every ambition his court had ever demanded of him, that she had never needed to hide at all. She had only needed to be found.